Hi, everybody. Welcome to Craft, Authors in Conversation. Thank you for joining me this evening for a very special evening with the wonderful Ray Suarez, who is joining us tonight. For those of you who are new and have not joined us before, the wonderful Craft series used to be hosted live and in person at Little Jumbo, lovely speakeasy here in Asheville, North Carolina. Due to the current circumstances, we have moved Craft online. I'm happy to say that Little Jumbo's role in the craft experience continues on. And for every craft event we have, even though it's online, the co-founder and mixologist from Little Jumbo continues to create specialty cocktails inspired by our author, who they are, what they've written, something about them. So we've got a really good one tonight for Ray Suarez, which I will be sharing about halfway through the hour. As always, our book sponsor is the wonderful, incredible independent bookstore Malaprops here in Asheville, North Carolina. How can we support Malaprops, you might ask, if I'm here and you're there and people are all over the country? There's a lovely little button right down there below our pictures that says order books by Ray and Denise, but you don't have to just order books by us. You can click over to Malaprops or the independent bookstore of your choice and order whatever books you want. But if you want to order books by us, we're into that too. Ray's got a ton. That's an easy link that takes you straight over there, and you're supporting a wonderful independent business, a wonderful independent bookstore, and let's all do more of that as this pandemic rolls on. To continue the very quick tour of the screen, as you can see, the chat is open. Feel free to talk to each other. Oh, hi, Stephanie from Malaprops is here. Hi, Stephanie. So feel free to say hi, talk to each other in the chat. Joe, as always, is lurking in the chat. If things come up in conversation that are points of interest, he will do his best to put links where you can find more information. When all of this is over, I am going to send a recap email to everyone that will go over some of the things that we talked about, give a link to this video, which will also be on my YouTube channel. I know somebody had been asking, how do I watch this or link to this? From sort of outside this space. You can do it over on YouTube. And once you've registered for this, you can watch it here. You can just come back to my Crowdcast page and go into past events and watch them. And then finally, last part of our little tour is the Ask a Question button. So rather than putting all the questions over here in the chat, which is fine if you do, the Ask a Question button is really wonderful. It kind of keeps all the questions in one place, makes sure that I don't miss them, because sometimes if I'm, doing my thing, it's easy for me to miss stuff over here. So please do put questions in there. And if you actually see something in Ask a Question, you can vote things up or down as well. So if somebody's already asked the question you want to ask, just vote it up and we'll make sure it gets answered. So without further ado, hi, Ray, welcome. Thanks.
Great to be here.
So nice to have you. So I'm not even going to try and start with your resume. I've met a little backstory. I've had the privilege of being interviewed by Ray in years past when he was at PBS NewsHour, and that's right. And I am so thrilled to be able to kind of be on the other side of the microphone in a sense now. You have done so many things throughout your career. And are still doing new things now. You've worn many different hats, but I think overall, if I were to label you, and God knows we all love to be labeled, I would call you a storyteller. You are a storyteller, and you have used so many different mediums over the years to communicate so many different kinds of stories. Is there any particular medium, from radio to television to now the web, books, etc., that you feel has kind of impacted you most or shaped you most as a storyteller?
Well, if you had asked me that earlier in my career, I think I would have said that radio was a superior storytelling medium because it was portable, it was immediate, it was able to infiltrate itself into more intimate spaces without all the stuff that's involved in doing TV. Early on, TV involved just a lot of stuff and a lot of people, and you couldn't just slip in somewhere and begin talking to people in the way you could with just you and your microphone and a small tape recorder. Over the years, the technology has gotten smaller, less intrusive, lighter, and in fact, the budgets of television have changed in a way that you don't have all those people and you don't have all that stuff anymore. So TV has gotten a little less cumbersome and is able to communicate tremendous truths and really take people to places that they'll never get the chance or are unlikely to get the chance to visit themselves. Radio is still it's still singular when it comes to its ability to be intimate and close to people and not create such a technological barrier between you and the person that you're talking to, that they feel inhibited, that they feel they can't be their real selves. After a while, they forget the microphone is there, really, with radio. It's harder to do still with television. Now, nothing beats just sitting with a person and talking to them to find things out. And so it is a real pleasure to be able to just talk at length with people, see the things that are important to them, have them show themselves to you in a way that doesn't have to be technologically mediated. But that really is for the sole province of print. If you want to be able to expand the reach of that story, you have to have other technologies to hand. So, they all have their upsides and downsides, but the human element and your ability to bring that to others is really the most important. It's at the core of all of this.
You mentioned intimacy, which is one of the first things that I thought of when you actually started talking about working in radio. And how would you describe how the level of intimacy in storytelling has changed when you start to look at even beyond television, but to podcasts, for example, which I think is sort of, for some people, their version of radio? How do you think that level of intimacy has been impacted by some of these technological developments with regard to actual online storytelling?
Well, the great gift of radio was that more often than any other kind of electronic medium, you consumed radio by yourself. No one says, "Hey, come with me, let's listen to the radio together."
Right.
So it's usually you and the radio.
Mm-hmm.
And as one of the greatest geniuses I ever worked with in radio, a guy named Gene Clavin used to say in New York, it's an intimate medium, but it's also a creative medium for the listener, because the listener is constantly creating images in their mind as they listen of what you're talking about. And unlike television, which just again involves stuff and a lot of interruption from the world around, radio, it's almost like kissing people right on the ear. You can really go deep in a way that you can't on television. Podcasts have sort of kicked that up into a new level because so many people listen to podcasts on earbuds, on personal listening devices, while they're doing something solitary like running or exercising or shopping. So again, that even heightens the intimacy. You're in a world that's just you and the message and nobody else. And there's nothing else that's interrupting you, nothing else that's impinging on your thought process. So podcasts have really kicked up the already ambient intimacy of radio into another realm. It's almost like you can drop your voice even further because you're not cutting through a lot of other din and a lot of other things that are going on in someone's environment. You're going right into their ear, and it's quite lovely, really, that way. And you can use your voice as a storyteller in different ways on podcasts that you wouldn't necessarily do for broadcast radio, for conventionally broadcast in your kitchen radio kind of radio or car radio.
You talk about how having that that kiss on the ear, that singular solitary experience of story allows the person experiencing that story to come up with their own images. And I immediately thought of, that's one of the wonderful things I love about reading. If I sit and I read a book, I'm coming up with all of this imagery as I'm go, whether it's nonfiction or fiction or a potboiler or whatever I'm reading. And, you know, and this reminds me of, you have not just done different forms of broadcast, you've done deadline-based breaking news coverage. You have done longer form journalism. You have done full-length books. How does your approach, how do you train yourself? Like, how does your approach to a story shift when you are, you know, if you're from kissing somebody on the ear to actually having them sit down with 300 pages of a book? How does your approach as a storyteller change?
One of the great gifts of a daily deadline reporter, for a daily deadline reporter, is to be able to do a book length story. Now, the first time I did it, it was daunting. It was really hard to, because I had been thinking in 3 and 4 minute bursts of information, economy of expression, economy of description, boil down, take that out, to get stories, sometimes complicated stories, down to 2 minutes or 2 minutes and 20 seconds on a luxurious day.
Mm-hmm.
And now here was the possibility of writing 100,000 words about something. And I had to not only reimagine what the arc of a story is, but also remember how to undo all that paring away. A lot of times you end up taking out lovely telling details, really great little quotes to achieve that economy, because you've got somebody breathing over your shoulder saying, look, I only have a 2.5 minute hole for this story. That's it. So you're reluctantly, it's like deciding which one of your children you're going to execute. You know, all these hard-won facts and hard-won interviews, you're cutting them down. Well, here I was finally able to just let it rip. And it was hard to just take the measure of it. But what a fun thing to be able to, in my first book, which was about American cities after the Second World War, to go to city streets, to apartment buildings and tenements and suburban subdivisions, and give people a feeling of what these places were like. It was like really like being told that there were no calories in pudding. It was like, oh yeah, all right, it's okay, just let's go, and not have to take out. For instance, I had a woman tell me the story of the first Black family to move onto her block. It's a middle-aged white woman, describing to me the experience of the first Black family to move onto her block in Louisville in the early 60s. And this was a whole, not just this block, but a whole part of town where Blacks were understood, not prevented by covenant, not barred by law, but understood simply not to live. This was a pediatrician from the Children's Hospital. He bought this house, and all of the neighbors in a couple of block radius got together, decided they were going to sell their homes. And at one point, somebody got the idea to take all the for sale signs in the neighborhood, throw them in the back of his trunk, and then pound them into this man's front lawn, so that when he got up in the morning and walked out the front door, he would see 64 sale signs pounded into his lawn. And she slowed down. You could tell her breathing had changed. You could tell that just the recollection of it was moving her in a way that even she didn't expect. And she told me how he slowly, one by one, took these signs out and piled them up against the front wall of his house, and then quietly got into his car and drove away. He stuck it out for a little while, and then they moved. And usually that's a story that's told from the point of view of the arriving Black family, and I got plenty of those stories as well. But to hear this woman who now was living in another part of the country and retired, remembering this vivid thing from when she was 10 years old, was just a wonderful, telling, detailed story. And what a gift to be able to tell the whole thing. Not a 10-second soundbite, not a 15-second soundbite, but her whole story from beginning to end. And I thought, I'm gonna like this. So it was great calibrating how to get some of these ideas across. So I think of my life as having these different ways. I mean, I know that when I have to tell a radio story in a brief, telegraphed kind of way, almost staccato kind of way, I can do that. And when it's appropriate, it's great. And then when my book life kicks in periodically, I can go into that easier gear and add things in that normally I'm forced to take out. It's wonderful.
There are, it really is wonderful to be able to dig into stories that matter to you. And even with book length projects, I'm often finding myself, it's not always so much what do I put in, it's what, like you said, what do I take out? And even on the longer form projects, you are, for the sake of a story arc, or the rhythm or the pace of the story, you really do have to look at those, just as you said, hard-won moments that you've had with another person you've interviewed, some documents you managed to find, whatever, and you have to kill your darlings. And it can be very, very challenging. And we do get a lot of people who watch us here who are writers or who are teachers. How did you take some of that experience? Because don't you often find like longer form works are really a collection of smaller story arcs? So do you think your ability to tell those really tight focused stories lent itself in a certain way to the overall arc of some of these 100,000 word works of yours?
The hard thing is to amass all this stuff and then discern the through line. And I really, it was hard. The first time it was really hard. But now I think I'm better at it. I hope I'm better at it, because I make this huge pile and then go through it again and start to understand what I've done. While I'm doing it, I haven't completely understood what I've done. But once I've got it all, once I've thrown everything I picked into the back of the truck, I can start to see what it is that I've got and start to understand, well, this goes in chapter 6, obviously, and this story helps illuminate this part of what I'm trying to tell. So I'll put that over there. And then again, you have a second set of revelations once you're writing it all up, because then you realize, oh no, actually that goes over here. And you've been at this a while and you've done it enough times that when you write a book out of order, when you write chapter 8 before you write chapter 4, you have to remember, do I have to give the first reference style reference here? Or am I saying for the third time that this is is what this is, or explaining what this acronym is. That kind of stuff you have to learn along the way. That's the sort of small pointillist detail stuff that you have to remember. But the fun part for me, as someone who has spent so much of my working life doing daily deadline reporting, the great luxury, the great gift of it all is to be able to immerse yourself so deeply into a topic, to learn the kind of things that you never get a chance to learn when you've got to file by 5 o'clock tonight. And to also just exult in the luxury of being able to accidentally find things that you weren't even looking for because you were on the way to finding something else. And that ends up in the book too. And that normally, when you're on a daily deadline, that kind of stuff, that kind of intellectual serendipity is kind of a luxury that you don't have that often, because every minute counts in a very different way. So it's been a gradual process of mastering this, how to deal with a mountain of stuff instead of trying to get it all down by 5 o'clock tonight.
Well, having started out in journalism myself, I mean, one of the things that those deadlines does for you is it forces you to make choices, right? I mean, it's like 5 o'clock is coming, or, the editor tells you, shorten this, you cut this or I will, you fix this or I will, tick tock, and you have to get very clear very quickly. And it, in a way, gives you kind of this laser focus about what you have to do. I find with books, I revert a lot of times in the editing process, once I've kind of done all the amassing, to approaching everything very analog and printing things up and looking at them that way, because I can sort of lay them out in a larger space. Do you have a specific sort of way that you like to organize your material when you're starting out on a project? Because we are going to talk about your new project as well. But do you have that approach?
I collate.
Mm-hmm.
So I stack it the way a producer would stack a show. And
Mm-hmm.
I start to thematically stack it so that I can review what part of the story this is, what part of the story this is, and remember, because as you know, the timeline often between those first things that you've gathered, those first things that you've squirreled away, and when you finally got it, and the last documents you get, the final interviews that you've been rounding up, it's been some time. So you have to actually remember what it is that you've got even before you start to write. So it helps me. I take an empty loose leaf notebook and I start to punch holes in printed pages and collate, and then start to review my notes, start to review the Xeroxes of documents, those kinds of things.
You talk about the economy of description, and I'm going to take that to the extreme economy of description that is represented by social media at times. And how has social media, to what extent has that impacted your role as both a journalist and as an author, if at all?
Well, for people who are hearing this interview that are older than 60, let's say, if you were to ask them how they first heard about various events from early in their life, they are likely to say radio,
Mm-hmm.
or from someone who heard it on the radio. Because radio in those days was the immediate medium. Television was only on, and television news was only on during very specific and brief parts of the day. The evening news, the main network newscast, was only 15 minutes long. And this idea of 24-hour news was still 20 years off. So what's happened is that radio has been supplanted as the medium of immediacy by digital media. So you'll get an alert. You'll feel well, I keep it in my back pocket, so I'll feel a little buzz on my butt, pull out my phone, and find out something for the first time. That's the first 6-line version of an event that I need to know about. That has created an enormous challenge to broadcasting, which the industry is still figuring out how to take the measure of this, what to do when the monopoly on immediacy that you thought you had is being replaced by this other medium. Television is trying to figure out how to take the measure of digital media, how to incorporate it into its own product offerings without picking its own pocket. So, you'll have the anchors from the evening newscasts like David Muir and others with their own widely subscribed Twitter accounts, for instance. And there was once upon a time, as newsrooms were trying to figure out what to do about digital media, they wouldn't put their own exclusives on digital before their own show aired. Because they'd say, we've got an exclusive. Why would we do that? Rather than understanding that they were actually building their own brand and building their own audience toward evening time, if they signaled to people that they had this great thing. We had this enormous argument at the NewsHour when we had an interview that other people weren't going to get for a whole day. And we finally, it was like moving a mountain. We finally said, we're going to put it on line 5 hours before we go on the air, because that's how this new world is going to work. So the conventional broadcast news world, even all these years later, is still taking the measure of what digital forces them to do, how it's encouraging them to adapt, what it's all going to mean. I think we can all find our lane, find our audience, and there can be synergies. And certainly big legacy media companies are figuring out right at this moment how to preserve the value of all the investment they've made in building up the name of CBS or NBC, and still be in this new world of buzzing phones and 6-line stories and 30-second reports and all of that. So if you want the world fast, you can get it fast. If you want the world slow, you can get it slower. There's not going to be that much that's slow anymore. Even NPR, whose main tentpole newscasts, Morning Edition and All Things Considered, featured longer form reporting. Anybody who's listened to those shows for a while can tell that they've sped up. There aren't any more 10-minute stories or 12-minute stories anymore. Not really. It doesn't really happen that much anymore. Occasionally, when they have something huge. But for the most part, it's really shorter stuff, because the pressure on certain members of the huge amorphous news world is to make it shorter and more compact. And because you're afraid the audience is going to move on. You're afraid the audience is going to go find something else to do, find something else to listen to, find something else to watch, be distracted by their phone or whatever. So when you're afraid of your audience, you no longer trust that they're going to hang around for 10 minutes. Even if it's 10 minutes of really great stuff, you're not sure anymore.
As from the point of view of someone who is choosing what stories to tell, you talk about the brevity of these butt buzzes that you get, and these stories that you first see, little snippets of. A lot of times in journalism or with books, you'll get, I don't know, I keep like idea files all over the place. I keep notebooks, I keep digital files of lots of things that just sort of like just kind of pique my curiosity, and I want to know more about them. But I'm never sure if they're a story, right? What goes into deciding, A, is this really a story? B, if it is, what kind of story is it? Is this 300 word, piece in the front of the book somewhere back in the day when we talked like that? Or is this a long form magazine article? Is this, my gosh, could this possibly be worth a book? But when the bar is 6 lines on social media, the decision-making process about what merits news or what merits a story, do you find yourself like changing what your ideas are about what actually merits something that deserves coverage?
Good question. No, I would have to say no. I'm trying to bring the values that I learned from 40 years as a reporter into the world of 6-line stories, in the hope that a 6-line story is just an amuse-bouche. And in fact, that isn't going to be all that you want to find out about this thing, that you will then click through, that you'll find more. But in effect, it makes you, the consumer, the editor, because your decision to click through is what determines the length of the story, because you've consumed the 6 lines. Now you're going to go in for the 1,600 words. I'm on alerts from The Economist, and I think they have come to a good balance. They don't buzz me on everything, but they buzz me on a good number of things. And when I can and when I'm interested, because those are different economies. Economies of interest and economies of time are 2 different things. I'll click through to read the complete write-through on that breaking story. The Times buzzes me through the day. And again, sometimes the headline is all I need to know. Rush Limbaugh died. That's enough. I don't really need to go much further than that. But, when Rush Limbaugh died, the Times buzzed me, and okay, I'm good, got it. But I didn't have to read much more than that. But certainly when details were breaking on the aftermath of the Capitol Hill riot, there were details that I had to keep abreast of, and I was always clicking through to find out new stuff. So I've never been a very good triager, which, thank God, I have a good memory. Thank God I have an ability to keep an inventory in my head of a lot of different things, or else I would just be overwhelmed by it. I'm not good at, I have piles of clips, for instance. And if it had ever turned out that didn't work as a system, I'll stop. I'm not an idiot. I'm not maladapted. If it didn't work, I'd stop it. But it works for me. I'll say, oh, wait, I think I tore something out about that, and go up to my office, and sure enough, I've still got it. And it's not something that I necessarily would have remembered the search terms for, to use that newspaper's search bar in order to find that thing. So yes, the search bar is wonderful. It's a tremendous thing.
Yes.
But if you remember a thematic thing about a story and not the specific headline or the specific time frame, search can sometimes be very difficult. So I'll just run up to the office, go to my file cabinet, and because I am extremely aged, I'll go to a piece of paper that was derived from taking a dead tree and mashing it into pulp and breaking down its lignins and putting ink on it. I may be one of the last people on earth who does that, but for now it works for me.
No, I still do it. I find there are different kinds of, there are different types of memory, and I have a highly visual memory. I can almost see a paragraph I read in my head, even if I don't remember what the title of the piece was. So I think there are all sorts of different kinds of memory that some are very well served by digital, some are better served, I think, by analog. And sometimes when people ask a lot of questions, as they do from people who have been doing this as long as you have, about what your process is, I think it's also important for people who are, either just getting started in writing or trying to shift to a different kind of writing, that you really do have to just find what works for you, because lots of, different things work for different folks. And getting comfortable with whatever your process is, I think, is a really, really important part of just continuing to evolve as a storyteller. Speaking of storytellers, so tell me a little bit about just what was it like to sit down with Howard Zinn? I have to know what it was like to sit down with Howard Zinn. Because this,
the Howard Zinn experience.
Yeah.
It's fun. It's fun. Well, it's a good example of the kinds of things that are able to happen in the 21st century that maybe wouldn't have happened at another time. An independent producer called me and said, "Hey, I have an idea for you. How would you like to do a public television documentary with Howard Zinn?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I mean, that sounds great. What's involved?" And he wanted me to do 7 hours of interviews with Howard Zinn about different passages in American history over the course of 2 days. And then he would weave those interviews with archival footage and other first-person testimony and make a nice little 3-hour PBS documentary out of it. So I went to an old industrial building in Queens, not far from LaGuardia, and sat in this old mill with Howard Zinn, and we talked over 2 days for 7 hours.
Wow.
About everything from pre-revolutionary America to the moment that we were talking in the early 2000s. Then the independent producer went on to start to raise money. Couldn't raise the money because it's just much harder to make pub TV documentaries these days. The money's just not there for a lot of projects that would have gotten made in the 70s or 80s, just don't get made today. He couldn't raise the money. So the thing, I thought, oh, well, I had gotten paid for my work. I was hoping for another payday as the narrator, but that didn't happen. Oh, well. So he sells it to an educational DVD production company. They make a DVD set of these interviews. And then somebody from the publisher saw the DVD series and said, this would make a great book. Contacted the independent producer to buy the rights. They called me, said, would you write the introduction and would you edit the conversation? I said, well, yeah, that'll be fun. And it'll give the thing another life, because you went and made this effort and you did this thing and it just didn't have much of a life. So this gives it another shot at life. And it was a really fun project to go back over this conversation and to write an introduction to this interesting discursive ramble over the landscape of American history for 250 years. It was really a fun experience. And I'm glad it happened. I wish, I wish it had been made into the documentary, but barring that, at least the thing found another way to exist, to get into people's hands and to get into people's heads. So terrific. A win.
It went from, because the conversations you were having with him, this was in 2007. So it actually, it's more than 10 years for it to find its new life, which is really incredible and fortunate, but also sort of speaks to the continued relevancy of this kind of approach to contextualizing and re-examining history. I mean, it's as relevant or more relevant today than it was when you were talking to him in 2007, than it was when Zinn, wrote his book.
And look at what a battleground the last 4 years have made out of American history.
Yeah.
It turns out there is no settled history. There is
Yeah.
no settled idea about what America is or who's American or who built the country. And all of this remains contested terrain. So the Zinn conversation is, in some ways, as fresh as the day we had it.
Yep.
When Donald Trump is defending the idea of keeping Confederate monuments up around the country, and millions of Americans say, yes, absolutely, that's a great idea. It's a reminder, if nothing else, that a lot of this not only isn't settled, but may never be settled.
It's one of the striking things. I mean, I read Zinn's book years and years ago, and it was one of the striking things of revisiting his thoughts via your interview with him, which also brought it to life in an entirely different way for me. But the almost increased relevance really, really struck me very hard. So, I mean, I cannot recommend highly enough, folks, to pick up this book, even if you haven't read the People's History of the United States. But towards the end of this book, you guys are talking about, Zinn is talking about a lot of the activism that took root, especially in the 1960s, which leads me, I was very excited to learn that you are embarking on a new project that really kind of kicks off with something very special that happened in 1965. So I know you can't tell us everything about it, but if you can tell us a little bit about it, that would be awesome.
Sure. In 1965, the United States rewrote its immigration laws. For 40 plus years, we had been using a quota system based on the foreign-born population of the United States in 1890. Basically, we took the census of 1890, looked at all the foreign-born people, created percentages, what percentage of people already living in the United States who were born in another country in 1890 were from Belgium, were from France, were from Ireland, were from the Tsarist Empire, and created quota percentages based on 1890. So here we were in 1963 and 1964, and Italians weren't pouring into the United States anymore. And Lithuanians and Poles and Russians weren't pouring into the United States in 1965. And it simply did not work any longer. The Europe-based quota system of the 1920s. Emanuel Seller, congressman from Brooklyn of German Jewish ancestry. Phil Hart, senator of Irish ancestry, created the Hart-Celler Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, that completely trashed that old quota system and opened the United States up to the rest of the world. And that single act, which President Johnson promised would not change the country, which one of its primary movers and shakers toward getting passage in the Senate, Teddy Kennedy, promised his colleagues in the Senate it wouldn't change the country. Well, it changed the country. We're living in the country now created by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. And when in 2045 or so, Virginia Dare 2.0 is born, the kid who flips the demographic reality of the United States so that a majority of Americans no longer trace their ancestry to Europe, but to Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that Virginia Dare 2.0 is the descendant of Teddy Kennedy, Emanuel Seller, and Phil Hart, and the Hart-Celler Amendment. It is an amazing story, and there were only a handful of Hindus in the United States before 1965. Now there are Hindu temples in suburbs all over the country. There were a relative handful of Buddhists in the country. the only real concentrations were in Southern California and Hawaii. Now there were Buddhists all over the place. There were a couple of 100,000 Muslims in the United States in 1965. Probably in the 2030 census, the number of Muslims will surpass the number of Jews for the first time ever. And it's something that was just unimaginable at earlier times in American history. All those changes were wrought by the 1965 Act. So I'm doing a legislative and oral history of modern immigration to the United States. And it'll come out just before the 2024 campaign kicks off in earnest, when I am sure immigration will still be a pretty hot topic that people will want to argue about. So
that's very exciting. What is the best place for? I definitely want to get to some of these questions, but I don't want to forget. And if I do, somebody yell at me in the comments. The best way for people to follow what you're working on. But before we get to questions, it is time to share. It is time to share Ray's specialty cocktail, brought to us by Little Jimbo. Your cocktail, that's right. So here we go. This is the Shalimar. Can you all see it? Can you all see it? Yes. It's hiding in my screen. Yeah. Okay, great. Everybody can see it. Okay.
In a shaker.
So, yes.
Combine Gosling's Black Seal. Now, Gosling's Black Seal is what?
Is rum.
Is it
rum? So
whiskey? Is it?
It's rum.
It's rum. Oh,
it's rum.
Okay.
Okay. So this was inspired. This is a twist on very old classic. This is from Shaw Gray, co-owner and mixologist over at Little Jumbo, and this is an homage to classic rum drinks. And the Shalimar, he named it the Shalimar because once a long time ago, he said he had the opportunity to go sailing on a wooden boat right off of Puerto Rico, and the name of the boat was Shalimar. So he decided that's what he was going to name this cocktail.
Okay.
So Gosling's Black Seal is rum. John D. Taylor Velvet Falernum is another kind of liqueur. It is a staple in Barbados for those sorts of mixed Caribbean drinks. Lime and
okay.
Yeah, so there it is. There it is, Ray Suarez. You got he created this for you. No one else has gotten this cocktail as far as I know. And the wonderful.
Fabulous. Well, I'm a big rum drinker.
There you go. So I'll send you your own version of that, and that'll go around to everybody when we do when I do the recap. But I would also like to say Little Jumbo here in Asheville, for those of you, I know a lot of you aren't here, but they are doing to-go cocktail sets with ice and closed bottles and beautiful little things. So if you want to swing by Little Jumbo and have a fancy cocktail set to go, you can do that. And so please do, if you are in and around Asheville, support Little Jumbo and their wonderful mixology talents. Okay, let's look at some questions here. And okay. Oh, this is great. So this is a question from Jerry. Ray, you have reported on so many things, so many stories that are really difficult and disturbing at times. What helped you from getting stuck in anger, and what gives you hope?
Well, some of the most difficult stories carry you right to the raggy edge of exploitation, because you're using people to illustrate a wider truth, perhaps about the world or the sufferings of people, but you have to use people to tell that story, and then you leave them. You leave them in the situation that you're covering them in.
Right.
Whether it's people who are sitting in the wreckage of their homes in New Orleans after Katrina, whether it is a teenager who's raising 6 of her cousins and her own 3 younger siblings, because both her parents died of AIDS and 4 of her aunts and uncles have died of AIDS. And all of these kids are now her responsibility at 19. You parachute into this woman's life. You explain and illustrate what she's up against as a way of having people in the United States understand the toll that HIV was taking in a place like KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa. But then you thank them and you go. You can't change the circumstances. You can't fix them up. You can't fix the situation. And it's the kind of stuff that's almost haunting. I mean, you know that their lives are in pretty rough shape, and you are very conflicted about what you've just done with them and what you're about to do with them when you take their pictures and put them on American television. So it's not an uncomplicated and not an arm's length, emotionally distant transaction. You've been in a hut with this young woman who's trying to keep up with the impossible demands of raising all these kids. You've seen her trying to keep track of meals and who's where and who's home from school, and she's still a kid herself. You have to think that it's important that this story be told to the rest of the world, or else it just definitely feels like exploitation, like you're creating a work of art using her as a model, and it's those kinds of feelings come up again and again. Sometimes people ask you for a certain level of anonymity because you're telling them telling a story about them that could get them in trouble. When I was working with undocumented people in Southern California during an immigration story, I had to just out of protection for them say, look, that's my cameraman. If you don't want him to show your face, you got to tell me now, or else I can't be responsible for what happens. But if you're human and humane, you can't help but think of the lives of these people after you get back on your plane and leave them where they are. It is a very difficult part of the job, because I think it's necessary to tell those stories, and at the same time, you know what's up, and you know the transaction that's being made. You intrude on them and their lives. They may be actually taking a risk to talk to you. You risk nothing. And so you have to care for them, and you have to take care of them, and you have to be aware of how to be decent to them, or else you are just using them up. It is a tough part of the job, actually.
That was a great question, Jerry. I know that on a different level, but I remember when I was working on the Girls of Atomic City, covering the segregation and the racism of Oak Ridge, and sitting for hours with Katie Strickland, who I was very lucky shared so much of her life with me. You're in this situation where you, like you said, you want the story to be out there. It's important for people to understand what happened, but you're spending all of this time asking people to, in Katie's case, relive some of the most painful moments of her life. And it is hard. So, but I did, perhaps somewhat similar to what you're saying, felt so strongly about the fact that people needed to know what happened. People needed to know that aspect of the history that had been, really kind of overlooked for a while. It keeps you going, but
yeah, but don't you also have to care for them?
Yes.
Don't you have to be careful with them as part of the transaction? Yes, you're letting me do this thing, so in return, I have to care about you because I'm a decent human being.
and I have to let you know what you tell me what you expect. I'm going to tell you what I'm hoping to expect. We're going to keep that dialogue open as we progress, as I'm interviewing you. If you're ever uncomfortable with anything, you let me know. It has to stay that kind of that trust and caring has to stay there, because no story's worth it otherwise. If you don't have that mutual respect for another human and another human's trials, really, as you go through those things. So yes, absolutely. Lauren is wondering, are there any you've covered so many stories. Were there any events or things that came along that you wished you had an opportunity to cover that you did not? In your case, the answer might be no. I don't know. Your resume is exhausting, so
I've been lucky enough to see a lot of things and be a lot of places that I sometimes had to pinch myself. I was at the last campaign appearance of Nelson Mandela's campaign for president at a soccer stadium in Durban, South Africa, and it was packed. And when he came onto the stage, it felt like the stadium was just going to lift off the ground. It was the most amazing thing. And I had been, I majored in African history at NYU. I wrote my senior thesis on South African history. And part of what I thought about when I was thinking about being a reporter as a teenager was to be in places and see things that told the history of the world. And that seems like such an abstract thing when you're sitting on the B train in Brooklyn. But when you're actually there, and there's Nelson Mandela right there, and the people are shouting at the top of their lungs, and he was just in prison the blink of an eye ago, and you think, oh, I have to pinch myself. I can't believe it. My plan worked. Why am I so lucky? Why would a schmuck like me end up with this plan working out? Here I am. I just think, boy, I am a lucky so-and-so. I really am. I thought, that's great. Now, are there aspects of stories? When I was working at the NewsHour, I wanted to do more politics than I did, but there were bigger feet in the shop, and they got to do. They got all the finer cuts of meat, and then I got what was left. So it's not really a big regret. I got my share. I moderated 2 presidential candidates debates in the 04 and 08 cycles, and you
occasionally got to
interview. I had fun. I learned a lot. Yeah. And I got to interview Denise Kiernan and Joe Daniesi. It should, for the record. And I'm not gonna go to my grave thinking, oh darn, all the things I didn't do. There are still places that I want to see, and places that I want to cover, places I haven't been yet. One opportunity, Al Gore invited me to lecture on a cruise ship that he was taking to Antarctica. After I came back from the climate conference in Copenhagen, he had seen my reporting and thought, oh, here's a guy that we should have on this global climate change cruise we're taking to Antarctica. But for those kinds of things, I had to ask my bosses for clearance, and they didn't give it to me. So Al took his boat to Antarctica without me, which is, I kind of regret that I didn't do that. But, I've had a lot of other great experiences and done work that fascinated me. So it would be churlish to complain.
I love that. This is from Tom Rickard. Oh my goodness, who I've known, at least 1 or 2 years. Question: as a credentialed, peer-reviewed, successful author and journalist, do you sense that the tidal wave of unfiltered information via digital media will render impotent current expert authors and journalists, sort of in a manner similar to the way Zinn kind of upended what was then accepted history? It's a great question.
It's already happening. As a reporter, I have to compete in a marketplace of, I don't want to even dignify by calling them ideas, a marketplace of notions with all kinds of garbage, things that are true, things that are half true, things that are semi-true, things that have a true thing at their center, but now are covered in all kinds of baloney. And it's hard. It was already hard before the digital world injected this new layer of ability to project ridiculous ideas into the public's consciousness in such an efficient, relentless kind of way. So now the news business, which is at a very weak point because of the failure of the business model, is competing against a just as well-financed baloney business that's parallel to and just as sophisticatedly produced as the truth. If, for those of you who remember Mimeo printers, mimeographs, if a newspaper landed on your front steps that was mimeographed with a staple in the upper left-hand corner, you wouldn't think that was the New York Times. You wouldn't even think it was the Asheville Courier. You'd look at this Mimeo sheet and you'd say, okay, I will accord to this the credibility that I think its production and sophistication are signaling me I should lend it. Now, baloney comes dressed as filet mignon and competes against a business that is very, very weak right now. And so there are notions about the world that I'm doing battle with as a reporter that are now deep-rooted. They actually have longevity and provenance, even though they're lies. So it's a very, very tough time for the truth business right now. And if you're working hard to find out the truth, you think, well, why bother? Why bother? People who aren't doing any work at all to figure out what the truth is can be online tonight with a product that looks beautifully composed, the pictures are properly cropped, the types well-sized and sophisticated, and what they're doing looks as good as what your local newspaper is doing, but it's baloney. So it's a really tough world right now if you're just somebody who's trying to make a living finding out things that are real and then turning around and telling them to people in a way that's credible, that they will then take on board as part of their working reality. Unremarkably, what the news business was for the last century, but now it's a very perilous moment, I think. Great question, though.
Excellent question. Not surprising that it came from Tom, and I agree with Tom. Please keep up the good fight. And you actually have also been in a position, and this is another question for me, and I think this is a good one to end on. You have taught in a variety of settings, and maybe doing so again. What do you say? Because I remain a firm believer in a free and unencumbered press, and the importance of the press to democracy. What do you say to a 19-year-old who wants to be a journalist? Knowing the world, knowing this world of
encourage them.
Baloney that they're going into,
I encourage them first, and then I tell them they have to have a really, and I mean really serious, credible plan B. Because a lot of people who are going to set out to make a living in the news business, to have an adult life in the news business, aren't going to be able to do it. Think for a second of how much more content there is in the world today in 2021. And let me lay this on you. There are fewer people making a full-time living as reporters in America than there were 21 years ago in 2000.
Wow.
And given that, you may not have ever get to the point where you'll have a single employer. You may have a portfolio of jobs, a stable of clients, but you're going to have to cobble your own material life together and buy your own insurance and fund your own pension and things like that, because you won't qualify for the 401k plans for the 3 different employers for whom you work part-time. And instead of that just being the story of your life as a young reporter who's 23 and 24 and 25, that could stretch into your 30s. You may end up living in your 4th city by the time you're 30 years old and not own anything and not have any money saved up, and think about the prospect of owning a place to live or starting a family may start to feel a little distant and a little abstract and a little fragile. So for those young people, and I've met many of them who are absolutely dead set on doing this as a way of life, thank God for them.
Sure.
They are smart, they are adept, they are formidably technologically trained across a variety of platforms, and they are doing amazing work and at the same time live perilous lives. I mean, to have a staff job for a well-funded media entity, and you're living in a group house in Brooklyn because it's too expensive to rent an apartment, you went and got this exquisite education. More and more of these kids have master's degrees in journalism.
Yep.
My answer about that is a little old-fashioned. I say, you get your master's degree in journalism on the hoof by being a reporter, but that's not the answer anymore. So they've got these really expensive, extensive educations, and they are piecing together livings into their late 20s and early 30s. God bless them. It's tough. It's tough, and I hope they stick with it.
Well, and I think they are all incredibly lucky to be able to benefit from what you share with them in the classroom, as we have all benefited from what you have shared with us this evening. And so you've been incredibly generous with your time as well. Just really quickly, I want to remind everybody that I'm going to send out a recap of what we talked about tonight. I'll explain what that bitters is from Barbados and the cocktail, and we'll
So
talk.
we can all make the drink.
We'll all make them. We'll talk a little bit about. I'm going to try and use the phrase Virginia Dare 2.0 3 times this week so that it just catches on maybe a hashtag. I don't know. We are back on March 3rd with Academy Award winning filmmaker Ryan Silbert and his writing partner, Aaron Tracy. They are the co-creators of an upcoming Audible original crime drama, The Coldest Case, which is starring Aaron Paul, for those of you, and Beau Bridges, for those of you who are old Breaking Bad fans, or just Aaron Paul fans, as many of us are. And it's set in James Patterson's Black Book universe. So very exciting. That'll be fun. Yet another brand of storyteller. Ray, thank you so much for not just for coming on and doing this tonight, but just for being out there and doing what you do in the world. And where can everybody sort of follow what?
Well, thank you.
Is?
Well, right now I'm doing a podcast for KQED FM in San Francisco called World Affairs. It's also on Apple Podcasts, if you get your podcast there, and a couple of other platforms, but it's called World Affairs. And so I urge you to listen to that. And one thing that I'm doing that you can't watch, unfortunately, is reporting for European television, covering Washington and everything that's been happening in this crazy city for European news audiences. But do keep follow me on Twitter at Ray Suarez News, so you'll see what I'm up to, because I'm also writing articles and I'll always attach them there. And Denise, thank you for finding me, and thank you for your generosity and thinking of me and bringing me on. And read her books; they're pretty terrific. And great to see you again.
Thank you. So good to see you.
And someday, when I won't die from it, I'll see you in Asheville, North Carolina.
That's right. You're going to come to Asheville.
We won't get each other sick.
We're going to drink Shalimars, and it's going to be a good old time. It is on. Thank you all. Everybody stay safe, be well.
It's a deal.
And we'll see you soon. Bye, everybody.